Thank you very much, Ross, for organizing this exhilarating couple of days. I hope to be able to connect to some of the threads that were developed yesterday, but let's see. What is the urban? One way to answer this question is to revisit an age-old distinction, that between city and countryside. As this graph suggests, the conventional understanding is that in the last 2 centuries, the rural has been eaten up by the urban, a process that is turning the world into one grey interior. Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt have called this process planetary urbanization. They identify spaces that lie beyond traditional city centers and suburban peripheries, or what they refer to as the erstwhile countryside, as integral parts of a worldwide urban fabric. Such spaces include anything from highways, shipping routes, nature parks, and agricultural land, and they even go as far as including oceans and the Earth's atmosphere. And of course, no need to reverse that argument. Now, despite allusions to its novelty, as we've also discussed yesterday, this argument is in some ways a bit old hat, if I may say that. Henri Lefebvre in the 1970s wrote already about what he called the total urbanization of society. And even in the field of architecture, which is kind of forgetful, I guess, similar arguments have circulated for a while now. Here, just one example of a project in the early 2000s looking at Europe as a single city. And we can identify kind of Italian school of thinking territorially since Rigotti, which is what LID also mentioned yesterday. And in fact, we could say maybe the idea of planetary or total urbanization is kind of integral to architectural modernism. Here you see Le Corbusier's continent-wide urbanization proposal to connect France and Algeria, a colonial project developed in the 1940s. But Antonia's analysis of Atantropa in Sergo is equally relevant here. Now, despite its seeming self-evidence and matter-of-factness, however, planetary urbanization is not so much an undeniable historical process of urban agglomeration than it is a way of seeing the world. And this is what I would like to problematize today. Namely, a specific way of seeing the world as a flat terrain in which places become inevitably connected to others, and in which being urban essentially means becoming connected. Such a worldview, I argue, obscures a similarly pervasive and consequential process that has reshaped the world in the last 2 centuries, namely ruralization, or the making of the contemporary rural world. And Nikos's graph yesterday, where he showed the growth of built-up area in relationship to the huge expansion of agricultural land and forestry and grazing area, I think already begins to suggest the importance of what I would call ruralization. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to begin to explore this historical transformation of the rural, or supposedly non-urban, from different perspectives, but focus on a period that is often understood as the cusp of planetary urbanization, namely the late 19th and early 20th century. And here an image of southern Brazil, which in exactly this period changed from vast areas of Atlantic rainforest being colonized by European farmers and transformed into a global hinterland. Now, I must say that this argument is very speculative at this point, and that the idea of, or the title of planetary ruralization started perhaps a bit tongue-in-cheek as a joke, so perhaps planetary should be understood here as imperial, in the same way that I believe planetary urbanization as a trope is more accurately termed imperial or imperialist urbanization. More about that in a bit. So my first proposal is to analyze the rural not only as a social and material process, but also as an epistemological project. And for such an analysis, the context of turn-of-the-century Germany is particularly fruitful. Between its founding in 1871 and 1914, Germany witnessed an unprecedented wave of industrialization and urban growth. In this context, the non-urban, or rather the slippery ambiguity between the rural and the natural, became central to intellectual production and cultural reform. German intellectuals projected the rural world as the natural origin of the nation and at the same time as the solution to the problems of the growing industrial city. Here the Wandervogel, a youth hiking movement, which first emerged in the suburb of Berlin, in search of a more natural culture in Germany's rolling hills and agrarian fields, as the image suggests. In short, the rural was reinvented or if not, invented in aesthetic discourse, which was located in the industrializing metropole. This projecting of the rural, or projection of the rural, interwove nature and nation. It was a matter, in other words, of cultural and social reform as much as nation building. This is what ultimately allowed rural farm buildings like this one to become mobilized in modernist manifestos for future building. In his Kulturarbeiten volumes, published between 1901 and 1917, the architect Schulze Naumburg argued that to protect Germany from the unsettling consequences of rapid industrialization and urbanization, architecture needed to be what was called bodenständig, or naturally rooted in the soil, just like supposedly this farm building. Such natural architecture would not only safeguard the Heimat or homeland, but was also essential to the development of modernism in general. Schulze Naumburg was the founder of Germany's environmental preservation movement, but was also involved with the Deutsche Werkbund, the predecessor of the Bauhaus. So it's important to note here that such movements were not just romantic, conservative, or reactionary, even though some of their adherents certainly were that, but that their remaking of the rural in this period was instrumental to a new territorial form of state power. By the turn of the century, Volkskunst, or German folklore study, an example of which you see here, had developed into a deterministic mapping of German culture onto the national territory. And the folkloric celebration of Germany's man-made landscapes by Heimatschutz advocates, or again here the Wandervogel on the right, correlated with German geopolitical ambitions as theorized by Friedrich Ratzel, and this is a geographer that also Antonia already mentioned yesterday. So Ratzel coined the concept of Lebensraum, or habitat, at the territory in which a state believes it is necessary for its development. And this is a concept later instrumentalized by the Nazis. But Germany was not an exception in this regard. Rather, a new regime of territory emerged across Europe and spread globally, or quasi-globally at this time. And Charles Meyer, the historian at Harvard, has described this regime as a Maxwellian one. A Maxwellian regime, Maxwell was the physicist who developed the theory of electromagnetic radiation. So a regime of territory which became infused with energy. So state ambitions, as Meyer describes, were both to expand the limits of territory as well as to master the great interior. I believe it is in this context that we can also situate the rise of urban planning. Here you see one of the first garden cities in Germany, Hellerau, built between 1909 and 1912, using the motifs, the architectural motifs, which Schulze and Naumburg had found in rural building traditions, but used to create a new suburban community. The Garden City movement was in fact integral to a political and economic project called internal colonization, which was being formulated across Europe at this time. Internal colonization ranged from the dredging of moors and fens to the construction of new farmsteads and suburbs. It was a project of optimizing territory by remolding unproductive lands of various kinds. Modern urbanism, in this sense, was not just anti-urban in that its aim was to offer an alternative to the chaotic growth of the industrial city through careful planning and suburban expansion, as you see here. It was anti-urban also in that it was pro-territorial, or driven by a new territorial mode of governance. In the introduction to this volume, which at first sight looks like it's a kind of manual about just designing leafy suburbs, the agronomist and Prussian minister, Hugo Thiel, emphasized that the new settlement designs in this book were ultimately about state governance. They were a way to ensure a healthy family life for the healthy life of the state. So Thiel understood the village as an analogy of the organic state. And this idea of an organic state is also something that scientists like Jakob von Uxküll and Rudolf Kjellén would soon theorize as biopolitics. So after Darwin, the relationship between humans and the natural world could be understood as obeying a set of fundamental biological laws. This in turn meant the possibility of a state directly governed by biological principles. So the natural and the rural, in other words, were projected here for the sake not just of reforming the city, as it's usually cast, but also to shape human life within the purview of this organic, so-called organic state that would essentially govern territorially. Okay, so you could say this is really a projection, right? A projection and an instrumentalizing of the rural rather than actual developments in the rural world. So let me shift terrain now and look at more concrete processes of ruralization in a setting far away from European urban centers. Here you see a map of Windhoek in Namibia, then the German colony of Deutsche Südwestafrika, or German Southwest Africa. With the formal expansion of colonial power into Namibia and in the 1880s also came the project of permanent settlement. The German colonial society was adamant on drawing German migrants to the colonies, and it identified the area around Windhoek as an ideal location for a farmer-based settlement. The area promised sufficient water and perhaps most importantly, military protection. And this map here gives you a sense then of how German colonial explorers understood this area and understood their colonizing endeavors. What we see here is abundant grass and brushlands in the wide river valley, sources of water, clay and lime, and military presence. The only remnants of former inhabitation are an abandoned mission, the former house of Jan Jonkers, leader of the Orlam group that controlled the area previously, and a few so-called old pontaks. And pontak was an Afrikaans word for the dome huts that built by several Southwest African polities. In other words, this map primarily shows the necessary resources for the settlement of German farmers on what seemed to be practically virgin land. So the map, in fact, erased Windhoek's history as the capital of the Nama Orlam people, which, as Marion Wallace describes in her history of Namibia, had a bustling urban market connected to the Cape at least since the 1840s. So mapping here was a practice of spatial reinscription which aided the process of African land dispossession that rapidly unfolded in the following decades with German colonization. So each family in Windhoek was given or was to be given a plot of land. The rest of the lands for herding and grazing would be communal. And this option or this kind of layout was debated. There were other options on the table, but this one was preferred over larger plots, for instance, or smaller plots, because it was deemed to foster a sense of community amongst settlers, but at the same time also still foster a sense of independence, right? Individual farmers with enough land for self-sustenance. Now, what was projected here was not a city. Urban concentration was to be avoided at all costs, and what the colonial government was after was this idea of independence of farmers, right? This was about the creation of a stable agrarian hinterland. In short, colonization in Namibia, more generally, amounted to the violent ruralization of the country. The creation of a Kulturlandschaft, as the Germans would have it, a cultural landscape in the image of Germany, which went together with the erasure of previous cultures, some of which were markedly urban, urban in the sense of mercantile and travel. Even though the new colonial landscape necessarily adapted some of the features of these existing building and farming practices, which colonists found as they arrived, it constituted a radical restructuring in terms of ownership, use, meaning, and construction. On the left, you see some more rudimentary farm buildings, which were initially built, and then eventually, or very soon after a decade or so, more formal or architect-designed farmsteads, some of which feature half timbering, for instance, at the bottom, and a kind of concealed veranda. In the colonial imagination, farmsteads were seen as naturally rooted in their Heimat, just as they would have been in Germany, recalling the theories of Schutz and Naumburg. This drawing by Erich Meyer, who moved to South Africa to work as a land surveyor and subsequently became a painter and artist when he moved to Namibia in 1904, this suggests a typical picturesque relationship between the farm and the surrounding landscape. Yet the modernity of this image is not so much that of the settler experience, but rather that of Africans being drawn into the marginalizing conditions of rural labor, forced and later wage. So what used to be native dwelling, the so-called pontaks, became displaced as temporary shelter for slave-like African labor, with the domed dwellings which you see on the right. German armchair colonists conceived of colonization as the transplanting of German village life in Africa. So colonization was seen as synonymous with Besiedlung, or settlement, and the demarcation of the soil, the concept that dovetails with the theories of Friedrich Ratzel. So conceptualizing the state as an organism rooted in the soil, Ratzel had suggested that just like plants, a people, a folk, needed to expand its territory or die. So from this theoretical perspective, architecture, including even rudimentary farm buildings such as the one depicted here, served as a vehicle for the necessary expansion of the Lebensraum, or habitat for the German people as a whole. In this sense, colonial architecture, even suburban-looking villas such as this one, seemingly transplanted from the suburbs of Berlin, did not so much urbanize Namibia as ruralize and Germanize it, creating an assumed natural relationship between soil and culture. And of course, this was highly artificial, as the architecture here makes clear. Despite the half timbering, no wood was used for this timber frame because it was scarce in this region, and the roofs were, despite their kind of complicated structure, are all corrugated metal. So this process of ruralization was only possible because of violent practices of segregation and dispossession. Goes without saying, I guess. As this map Windhoek shows, this involved intensive efforts of policing. What you see here is a range of police buildings with at their margins what were called werfen, or camps for Africans. Ruralization was also intimately tied to the biopolitical strategies of the colonial state. An example of that are the so-called Heimathäuser, or homeland houses or institutes, several of which were in operation in the colony. Now these institutes, or homes, were meant to welcome newly arriving colonists, women mainly, and to kind of make them familiar with the settler lifestyle. So for the colonial governor, these homes were a perfect answer to the much lamented lack of women, of German women, in the colonies. And the goal was that they would supply marriageable, these homes would supply marriageable women to the male-dominated German colonial population. So with these Heimathäuser, ruralization was ultimately meant to promote a healthy German family life in the interest of the colonial state. And there was, of course, widespread anxiety at this time across the German colonies about racial mixing, which informed a range of measures to deter heterosexual relations with women consented, but more generally forced, of course. And Heimathäuser were seen as one such measure. In the governor's words, they would contribute to, quote, the duty of our race, which is to avoid the loss of Deutschtum, or Germanness. So despite such, what Foucault would see as novel biopower, or the kind of social engineering, ultimately not untypical of the welfare state, there was enough old school power to go around, as you see here, and this was palpable in the colony's intensive militarization. German colonization did indeed leave a sprawl of forts across the country, the most well-known of which is this one, the Alte Feste in Windhoek, which strangely did not actually serve in war, but is most well known for the concentration camps that were built up around it during and after the Libyan War of 1904 and 1908. Militarization, however, fundamentally shaped the colonial landscape at large. Here you see a typical example of German colonial housing production called the 10-man house, or the 10-man house. It offered accommodation for 10 single administrators, colonial administrators. The H-shaped plan of the building was not the most logical for organizing the housing of 10 single men, but that could have been done perhaps in a more efficient way. So this organization in an H-shape was rather meant to allow the building to look like a fort, with 4 expressive corner towers and a veranda in between them, just like the Alte Feste, the fort I showed you here. So this farm building in the southern part, the drier southern part of the country, is an even more explicit example, as it was made to look exactly like a medieval fort, almost in a kind of Disneyland imagination of it. So this is the visual expression, you could say, of a new neo-feudal rural system that fundamentally altered much of this part of Namibia. So even though colonization did entail the growth of new modes or new nodes of commercial trade and political control, such as in Windhoek here, if you look more broadly at the historical development of Namibia, you could claim that it was ruralized and militarized rather than urbanized. And this pattern also persisted and transformed then into the apartheid regime which characterized Namibian history in the 20th century. So planetary ruralization, in this case, means a process of imperial expansion in which large swaths of land were turned into the rural hinterlands of a consolidating state capitalist system. Now, you might argue that this is again an unrepresentative example, since we're looking here at what is still one of the least densely populated countries in the world. So let's look at another site of ruralization back to Germany's imperial heartland. What you see here is the village of Golenhofen, or Golentio, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Now Poland, but then located in Prussia. The village included not just farms, but also a church, a school, workers' houses, an inn, a bakery, poorhouse, and even a little bathhouse and a fire station. All of which were designed in styles that we called age-old German building traditions. Although it looked like it had grown over centuries, the entire village was built from scratch just a few years ago, after taking these pictures. Golenhofen was in fact a rural modernization project of the Prussian Settlement Commission. Between its establishment in 1886 and 1918, this state organization settled close to 150,000 Germans in farming villages in Prussia's eastern provinces. And this entailed the construction of no less than 57 churches, 497 schools, and over 700 other public buildings, in addition to thousands of farmsteads. So just in comparison, compared to Namibia, to which less than 15,000 Germans migrated in the colonial period as a whole, the resettlement of Germans in Prussia was a form of colonization much larger in scale. The aim of this internal colonization project was to strengthen German nationhood in the eastern provinces against so-called Polonization, or the increasing influence of Polish culture. And it would do so, it would do this by resettling farmers, German farmers and workers. And in this map, here we see pink areas, or those with an existing German majority. Green are the settlement projects of the Commission, which gives you a sense of the enormous scale of this operation. German officials cast Polish farmers as backwards, their agricultural techniques as inefficient, and their architecture as primitive. So the tropes of colonial ideology seemed readily applicable to the resettlement project. But despite parallels with Namibia, for instance, race worked quite differently here than it did in the colonial world, or the former colonial world. Polish people had namely full citizenship in the Prussian state, and there was no formal interdiction of Polish-German marriages or any explicit segregation policy. Moreover, internal colonization was not solely motivated by an anti-Polish racist agenda. An equally important aim of the Prussian Settlement Commission was the transformation of large landholdings into smaller farmsteads. And this was a way to counter proletarianization by strengthening the German rural Mittelstand, or middle class. 2 more minutes? Okay. I'll speed up. So it was, in other words, a ruralization strategy in which the rationalization of land use correlated with a project of social. These goals are directly reflected in the design and layouts of settlements such as Goelnoven, which aim to both create a community of German settlers, but again, the idea of independence and self-sustenance. And I'll go quickly over this then. Initially, the farmers built their own settlements or their own farmsteads, but a decade into the program, Paul Fischer attempted to streamline building production by using vernacular building techniques and creating a kind of system of construction that was both centralized and flexible. So ultimately, this was an architectural system of ruralization that effectively served to wipe out centuries of Polish presence in the region. It was a matter of mastering the interior, a territorial project in which architecture, agriculture, and social policy played an equally important role. All right, so to conclude quickly, what I've tried to show is that concurrent with rapid industrialization and urbanization during the Age of Empire, there was the emergence of a whole range of interventions focused not just on the urban, but also on the rural world. Ruralization entailed not only the rationalization of agriculture, but also the managing of migration, techniques of colonization, social engineering, and practices of nation building. These can be said to amount to a planetary form of ruralization in the sense that they connect distant and previously disconnected geographies. But crucially, this did not mean the invention of a flat, urban or urbanized world, but rather the making of unequal, disrupted, dependent, and ultimately also disconnected geographies. So the process of planetary urbanization that scholars routinely identify as one of aggregation or clustering into large-scale urban networks and hyper-regions is in fact a highly uneven process of both urbanization and ruralization, in which large swaths of land were turned into the hinterlands of a new type of system. So it is in this sense that ruralization underlies what is perceived more readily, namely the spectacular growth of cities worldwide. So ultimately, the rural is more than just, and I'm quoting Neil Brenner here, an ideological projection derived from a long-dissolved pre-industrial geo-historical formation. I think the rural is integral to our modern territorial condition and needs to be studied as such. Thank you.